Hi, I'm Tom Birkeland, author of An Introduction to the Policy Process and professor of public policy at North Carolina State University. I hope you enjoy the book, and I hope you find these videos useful. So let's start our investigation of the official actors with the legislative branch in the public policy process. Now, the legislative branch is listed in Article 1 of the Constitution, of the United States Constitution, and it probably comes early in your state constitution as well. Why do you think that the legislative branch is the first named branch in the Constitution, and does that rationale still hold today? I suspect it's because the framers of the Constitution expected that the Congress would be the most active policymaking in American government. And if you look at American history, and if you look at the eras of public policy I covered in Chapter 3 of the book, you'll see that Congress did a great deal more than compared to the executive branch than today. The executive branch was often not in the lead on making new policy the way it is now. So the founders probably imagined that the legislative branch would be the most active policymaking branch, but of course would be checked and would be balanced by the other two branches. Now, what does the legislative branch do? I'm sure all of us are familiar with how a bill becomes a law. So it makes laws, in particular makes what we call statute laws, book laws that go on the statute books or in your state's statutory code, however they're compiled. But they also hold hearings. Congress holds hearings to discuss legislation. They hold hearings to discuss how much money to budget. But they also hold hearings to perform oversight over the executive branch. That is to say, they hold hearings to see if the executive branch is doing what Congress, or a majority perhaps of members of Congress, want the executive branch to do. And we'll talk a little bit more about oversight, but it's said that it's not a particularly pleasant experience for some executive branch officials to go to an oversight hearing because sometimes they get really tough questions. Related to this sort of supervision over the executive branch on the part of the legislative branch is doing casework for constituents. Casework is things like if your grandma didn't get her Social Security check, or you're not getting your veterans benefits, or you've been waiting for the federal government to do something, or perhaps your state government, if it's a state legislator, to say issue a permit for a business, or any of the sort of the routine business that's done by members of Congress. Members of Congress do this casework for constituents to build a relationship between constituents and the legislative branch. In a sense, the legislative branch, the individual legislators, are ombudspersons for constituents. They serve as problem solvers. They call up an agency and say, my constituent has been waiting a really long time for a passport and needs one right away. That can often shake things loose and get things done quickly. So that's a very popular thing that members of Congress want to do for their constituents. So what you can see here is they do more than just come together and write laws. There's a whole lot of other legislative activity that may not ultimately find its way in the statute books or in a fully formed program of government activity, but is all part of the role of the legislative branch in the policy process. So what are the power advantages and disadvantages of the legislative branch? What are the things that you think make the legislative branch a particularly powerful branch, and what things make them less powerful vis-a-vis other branches of government? I'll give you a hint. One of their powers, of course, is this casework and oversight power. On the other hand, the executive branch is led by only one person, whereas there's, 535 members of the House and Senate in the legislative branch, so it may be more decentralized than the executive branch. These are things to consider as you consider the relative strengths and weaknesses of the, or advantages and disadvantages that each branch has in the policy process. Now, one of the ways we measure legislative activity, of course, is through bill introductions. As you can see, bill introductions vary somewhat from year to year, but you can see, for example, in the 105th Congress, there was quite a bit more legislation introduced in the 115th Congress in 2018 and 19 compared to the 105th in 1997 and 98. It was very busy in terms of bill introduction. And keeping in mind that bill introductions, not every bill has a chance of becoming a law, but every bill introduction is an opportunity for a member of Congress to stake out some symbolic ground and say, look, I've introduced this bill because I think this matters as a matter of public policy. It matters for my constituents. So how do we assess legislative activity? First, you have to understand that the raw measures of legislative activity, that is bill introductions, maybe overstate the number of actual ideas that are before Congress, because a lot of bills are introduced on the same subject, and sometimes multiple bills have very similar, if not identical, language. Especially a House bill or a Senate bill version might overlap to a great extent, or there might be minor changes made that are introduced in a brand new bill. Many bills are introduced symbolically. They're introduced to make a key interest in one's district happy, or a key set of constituents, and to be able to claim credit for saying, yes, I introduced this legislation. Oftentimes, the minority party will introduce bills with policy ideas that they know have no opportunity to pass into law, but that put a marker down on the agenda so that they can say, if we had the majority, we would move this bill forward. And you may see in the next Congress, if the Democrats take over, that some of the bills that died in committee in the Senate, in particular, may have a new life in a Democratic Senate if that comes to pass. Many bills then are introduced to serve constituent interests, as I mentioned above. Oftentimes, a member of Congress will introduce a bill to serve a constituent's desire to see some sort of action taken on some issue. But how do we know what's on the agenda just from a count of bills? Why does it matter what's on Congress's agenda is the big question. And is the volume of legislation the best measure of overall activity? And the answer is it's really not. A better measure of what's really important to Congress is what bills advance in the process through the hearing process and then into floor debate and ultimately a vote in the body, in the full chamber. This is part of the agenda setting process that's central to the policy process. As an aside, I had my first job out of my master's program was keeping track of bills in the New Jersey legislature to see how many were introduced, and there were a lot of them that were introduced. I was keeping track for the State Department of Transportation, and we said, how does this bill affect us? And we had a spreadsheet, and we coded each bill and said, the closer it gets to the floor, the lower the number. So if it's on the floor ready for a vote, it's a 1. If it's in committee, it's a 6, and numbers in between. And this way we were able to track the difference between the bills that were really important and the bills that had just been introduced without a chance of really becoming law. And that lobbyists and other professionals in Washington, D.C. and in state capitals are doing this sort of tracking of bill introduction to understand what ideas are most likely to arise on the agenda. Now, before I mentioned casework as something that Congress likes to do, because where else do people take their problems with the federal government, and to where do they appeal if their initial complaints aren't heard? In other words, if you complain to the passport office that your passport hasn't been issued yet and you're in a hurry for it, and you're about to take a trip and you thought you gave them plenty of time and you still haven't seen it, and so you might call someone in the State Department in Washington, D.C. and say, hey, where's my passport? But they may not give you the answer you want. So you may need to appeal to your member of Congress, and your member of Congress, regardless of your political party, is going to be happy to help you to try to solve the problem so that when election time comes around, you can say, oh yeah, Congresswoman Jones or Congresswoman Smith is really effective at getting things done. She freed up my passport, or she made sure grandma got her Social Security benefits, or whatever. So that builds goodwill with constituents, which is exactly why members of Congress encourage casework, to build that goodwill between constituents and members of Congress. The staff are very busy in that process, by the way, and that's something you really want to keep in mind when you're talking about Congress. You're talking about not just the members of Congress themselves, but the staff, and the staff can make phone calls or write letters on behalf of the congressperson. And it's useful in the policy process because it helps sort of grease the skids to get things done. And it's a form of feedback back to both Congress and the executive branch about what's working well and what might not be working as well in the policy process. Now, oversight is similar in that sense that it provides feedback to Congress. So what is oversight? Oversight is when Congress holds hearings or commissions the Congressional Research Service to write reports, or engages the Government Accountability Office to do an investigation to see whether and to what extent the executive branch is doing a good job in a particular area of public policy. For example, Congress has held oversight hearings to deal with the FAA because of the perceived failings of the FAA in regulating aviation safety around the problem with the 737 MAX airplane. So there's no laws being made, but Congress is saying in these hearings, there are laws and rules that need to be followed, and why were they not followed? Or if they were followed, how did we get to a situation where Boeing could make an airplane that seems to be as unsafe as the 737 MAX has become? Now, why has this become more important? In large part, there's two reasons. One, there's a lot of government programs. You know, the government, especially in the 1960s and 70s, was very active in creating new programs. And for every new program, there's likely to be some urge on the part of Congress to perform oversight over that program. The second reason is that oversight is less politically dangerous in some ways than writing legislation. A lot of times everybody can agree that, for example, the FAA should make sure that airplanes are safe, or that if the law says that you should be able to get a passport in 6 to 8 weeks, you should get one in 6 to 8 weeks. Or if we're distributing food aid or welfare or anything like this, is this effectively and efficiently delivered to the people who most need and deserve it? Those are the kind of questions that Congress asks. So everybody is interested in, as the language says about the president in his oath, taking care that the laws be faithfully executed. Congress has a role in seeing to it that those laws are faithfully executed from the perspective of the legislative branch. And so this is one way the legislative branch communicates with the executive branch about what it wants done. And it does it through several methods. Oversight hearings, as I mentioned before, including field hearings. Field hearings are hearings that are held at a location where something happened that Congress wants to know about. This is particularly interesting to me in my research because I study natural disasters. And oftentimes, if disaster relief is handled badly, they'll hold a field hearing, say in California or Louisiana or wherever the disaster happened, and ask people, what's been your experience with FEMA? Did you get the relief you were promised? Was it timely? Was recovery supported by the federal government, by FEMA and your state officials, things like that? So hearings are a big form of oversight, but constituent communications and information and communication from interest groups is also important to Congress's oversight function. It's also important to the legislative function. It's how they get their information to address the ideas they think that they should be dealing with, to address problems. The news media is another important source of information. And internally, the Congress has the Government Accountability Office, the Congressional Budget Office, and the Congressional Research Service, all of which provide information to Congress to help them make policy and help them to overcome some of the information disadvantages they have vis-a-vis the executive branch, which has more day-to-day knowledge of how policies are being implemented. As an example, I participated in lobbying day the last 2 years for an organization called COSA, the Consortium of Social Science Associations. And this past year, because of COVID, we didn't go to Washington, but we were able to do Zoom meetings and other forms of outreach and just share with members of Congress, actually their staffs. We didn't talk to one member, but we certainly talked to their staffs. And we shared with them what this association of social science associations, like the American Political Science Association and the American Sociological Association, how we can help inform Congress about pressing issues like the COVID pandemic or racial justice or any of the other hot topics that are on Congress's agenda now. So this is an important part of the policy process, and again reinforces the idea that it's not just about making laws. It's also about doing other activities that support the legislative function.
Thanks for watching this video. As always, I really enjoy hearing from students and teachers about the book and about public policy. Feel free to reach out to me at tom@tomberkland.com or visit my website, tomberkland.com. Thanks again for watching.